The humiliation of being kicked out from the flight in front of everyone is an experience that cuts deeper than most people can imagine. It is not only about being physically removed from a place, but about the way the entire scene unfolds in slow motion for the person at the center of it. As she stood there in the aisle, the airline staff speaking to her in a firm but dismissive tone, it felt as though every single eye in that cabin was piercing into her, trying to understand what she had done wrong. People did not know the details, but human nature does not wait for explanations. Whispers spread like wildfire, passengers exchanged quick glances, and judgment filled the air. Some shook their heads, others smirked with a mixture of pity and superiority, as if they had never been in a position of helplessness themselves. What made it even worse was the sound of seatbelts clicking, not because of turbulence, but because people wanted to lean closer and catch the drama unfolding in front of them. The embarrassment wasn't just about her seat being taken away, it was the stripping away of dignity in a place where she should have been treated like any other traveler. To be singled out so publicly made her feel small, almost invisible, even though every set of eyes was fixed on her. She could feel her face burning, her heart pounding, and her hands trembling as she clutched her bag tighter, unsure whether to argue or quietly obey. The staff's cold expressions showed no compassion, only authority, and that imbalance of power made her feel cornered. Even when she wanted to explain, her voice was drowned under the rehearsed responses of airline officials who seemed more concerned with procedure than with humanity. To them, she was just a problem to be dealt with swiftly, but to her, it was a shattering moment where her identity and worth were being dismissed in front of strangers. Every second seemed to stretch longer than the last. The murmurs grew louder as she was asked to step aside. Children stared openly, adults whispered in hushed tones, and some even recorded on their phones, eager to capture a spectacle without considering the cost to the person being humiliated. The aisle became a stage, and she was the unwilling actor forced into a role she never auditioned for. Each step she took toward the exit felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of shame was pressing down on her shoulders. No one reached out to ask if she was all right. No one questioned whether the treatment was justified. Instead, the crowd's silence and stares confirmed her worst fears, that in that moment, she was entirely alone, left to endure the humiliation without support. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions. There was anger at the injustice, sorrow at the way her humanity was disregarded, and a quiet fear of what awaited her once she left the safety of the plane. She wondered what people thought of her, how they were crafting stories in their minds about who she was and why she deserved to be removed. Some probably assumed she was dangerous, others thought she must have broken rules, and none of them considered the truth. It is in these moments that judgment becomes the harshest, when people build entire narratives around fragments of information, leaving the real story buried beneath layers of assumption. She swallowed back her tears, determined not to let them see her break. The humiliation was sharp, but she carried within her something they could not see, something that gave her strength even as the world around her tried to tear her down. What they saw was a woman being kicked out of a flight, powerless and shamed. What they didn't know was that behind her silence was an identity far greater than any of them could imagine. But for now, she carried that secret like a shield, letting the humiliation wash over her without revealing that the person they were casting out so carelessly was someone who had walked through far greater battles and survived them. The whispers, stares, and judgment from bystanders watching her downfall carried a weight that was almost unbearable. As she stood there in the middle of the boarding gate, her boarding pass crumpled in her hand, it felt as though the entire terminal had conspired to turn its attention toward her. Eyes that had moments earlier been focused on departure boards, cell phones, and luggage now flicked toward her with curiosity, disdain, or pity. The whispers weren't loud, but in her mind, they grew into deafening echoes. Each muttered word seemed sharp enough to cut, each raised eyebrow enough to condemn her without trial. People leaned into each other, whispering half-baked theories about why she had been removed. Some assumed she had done something wrong. Others thought she had caused trouble with the staff, and some were simply entertained, treating her humiliation as if it were a form of live theater before their flight. The stares burned into her skin more than any words could. A young couple exchanged knowing glances, as if they had already decided she must have deserved it. A businessman with his suit jacket slung over his arm smirked ever so slightly, enjoying the break in monotony that her suffering provided. A few passengers wore looks of pity, but pity can sometimes cut deeper than mockery, because it reduces someone to a figure of helplessness. The cruelest of all were the eyes that held no empathy, only judgment, as though watching her fall validated their own sense of superiority. Everyone became a silent jury, and she the defendant in a case she hadn't even been allowed to defend. There was a certain cruelty in the way people watched without speaking, their silence carrying its own verdict. No one stepped forward to ask if she was all right. No one questioned the airline staff's actions. Instead, they sat or stood still, content to observe from a distance. It was as though the simple fact that she had been singled out justified whatever treatment she received. Human nature has a strange way of turning spectators into participants, and in their stares, she felt the full weight of collective condemnation. It was as though every glance declared, "You are less than us. You are unworthy." Her humiliation became entertainment. Some passengers discreetly lifted their phones, recording the scene in shaky secrecy, eager to capture a moment they could later share or gossip about. The thought that her suffering might soon exist on someone's social media feed made the humiliation more raw. It was one thing to be judged in the moment, but another to think that judgment might linger far beyond the terminal, frozen in pixels for strangers to mock. She could feel herself shrinking under the invisible spotlight, every inch of her skin prickling with the awareness that dozens of eyes were dissecting her every move. In that sea of stares, there were no allies, only critics. People formed silent conclusions without ever hearing her story. They didn't know who she was, what she had endured, or why she was truly there. They saw only what was on the surface, a woman being removed, powerless against the authority of the airline staff. To them, she was not a person but a symbol, a scapegoat for whatever frustrations they carried about delayed flights, cramped seats, and endless queues. She became an outlet for their discontent, an easy target to project their dissatisfaction onto, because watching someone else's humiliation somehow dulled their own. Inside her chest, anger and sorrow battled for dominance. She wanted to scream, to tell them the truth, to make them understand that their whispers were knives carving into her dignity. But she held it all in, her silence a shield against a world that did not deserve her words. The irony was bitter. They judged her as weak while she stood in silence. But that very silence was proof of her strength. They thought she was defeated, but they had no idea who they were truly staring at. The whispers and stares were a test, a cruel trial of endurance, and she met it not with anger, but with the unflinching composure that only someone forged in the harshest of battles could carry. What made the stares so painful was not just the judgment, but the reminder that people are quick to believe the surface of a story without searching for the truth beneath it. She knew that if they had seen even a fraction of what she had survived, the way she had fought in places darker than any of them could imagine, their stares would have been filled with awe instead of disdain. But in that moment, stripped of context and identity, she stood alone, reduced in their eyes to a spectacle, and yet quietly harboring a truth that none of them were prepared to face. The sudden halt at the boarding gate brought everything to a standstill. Uniformed staff moved with urgency, their radios crackling with clipped instructions, their faces tense with an authority that could not be questioned. The airline crew surrounded her, and in a voice that carried no room for negotiation, they ordered her to step aside. Passengers who had been shuffling forward with boarding passes in hand froze, their annoyance at the delay replaced with curiosity at the scene unfolding before them. The air thickened with suspicion as people glanced around, whispering, wondering what she could have possibly done to provoke such a reaction. To most, she was just a woman with a boarding pass and a quiet demeanor, but suddenly she was being treated as if she were a threat to the entire plane. The accusations were not voiced aloud, but they hung heavy in the air. Every shift of the airline staff's posture, every sidelong look they gave her, suggested that she was dangerous, untrustworthy, someone who had to be removed. The unspoken implications stung more than any words could have. People craned their necks to see what was happening. Passengers exchanged quick theories in hushed tones, and some clutched their belongings tighter, as though her presence alone might endanger them. She could hear snippets of conversation, someone speculating about her identity, another suggesting she must have triggered some security alert. The words cut because they were built on assumptions, on fear, on ignorance. It was strange how quickly suspicion spread, like a ripple in water. A moment ago, she had been invisible in the crowd, just another traveler among many. Now, every eye was on her, and every glance carried a weight of judgment. The uniformed officers who approached her carried themselves with the authority of those certain of their duty, yet beneath their stern faces, there was hesitation. They didn't know who she really was, but they had been ordered to act, and so they did. Their actions made it clear that in the eyes of the airline, she was no longer a passenger. She was a problem to be dealt with, a disruption that needed to be removed before the plane could take off. The scene was humiliating, but also infuriating. She had spent her life operating in the shadows, trained to neutralize threats that could bring nations to their knees, and now she was being accused, without evidence, without reason, of being the very kind of threat she had dedicated her life to eliminating. It was a bitter irony, standing there powerless while being painted as dangerous by people who had no idea of the sacrifices she had made. Her hands remained steady at her sides, but her heart pounded with the indignity of it all. She knew she could end the entire charade with a single sentence, with a flash of the truth that lay hidden in her past, but revealing herself was not a luxury she could afford. The oath she had taken bound her to silence, even in moments like this, where silence was mistaken for guilt. Passengers who moments earlier had smiled politely at her in line now looked at her differently, suspicion etched on their faces. A mother pulled her child closer. A man shook his head as though disgusted by the inconvenience she had caused, and others simply stared with wide eyes, eager for drama, but unwilling to intervene. It was astonishing how quickly perception could shift, how easily a person could go from being just another traveler to being treated as an outcast. The isolation pressed in on her, not just from the airline staff surrounding her, but from the invisible wall that the passengers' suspicion had built between her and the rest of the crowd. The staff's voices grew sharper, their tone more commanding. They asked her to step back, to hand over her boarding pass, to answer questions she knew were pointless. Every word they spoke added to the image being painted in the minds of the onlookers. She was guilty of something. The details didn't matter. Guilt was assumed, innocence irrelevant. She knew this was the dangerous power of perception, how quickly truth could be overshadowed by appearances. And yet, she stood calm, letting them project their fears onto her, absorbing the humiliation without resistance. Her silence became its own kind of strength, a quiet defiance in the face of false accusations. The irony was cruel. The very skills that made her invaluable in the field, discipline, secrecy, the ability to remain calm under pressure, were now the same traits that made her seem suspicious. To the passengers and the staff, her calmness looked like coldness, her silence like guilt, her composure like the stillness of someone hiding something. They couldn't comprehend that what they were witnessing wasn't the demeanor of a threat, but the restraint of someone who had been trained to endure far worse. She let the storm of suspicion rage around her, because she knew that to fight it would only confirm the false image they had built. The commotion at the boarding gate had drawn the attention of nearly everyone in the terminal. Conversations hushed, phones were lifted discreetly to record, and passengers leaned forward in their seats as though they were watching a live drama unfold. The woman stood still, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady, and yet the tension around her was palpable. What began as a simple delay had escalated into a spectacle, and now the whispers in the crowd were louder than the instructions of the airline staff. People speculated freely, filling the gaps in their knowledge with assumptions and fear, painting her as someone she was not. The irony was sharp. The crowd craved a villain, and without evidence, they had chosen her. It was in this charged atmosphere that the sound of polished shoes striking the floor cut through the noise. The rhythmic steps carried an authority that was immediately recognizable, and heads turned to see a man in a sharply pressed uniform approaching. He was no ordinary traveler. His bearing, the precision of his movements, and the medals glinting faintly on his chest made that clear. A colonel. The kind of presence that demanded respect without needing to raise his voice. The crowd instinctively made way for him. The same passengers who had moments ago been so quick to condemn, now stepping aside to allow someone with unmistakable authority through. The colonel's eyes swept over the scene with the sharpness of someone accustomed to battlefield assessments. He didn't see a disruptive passenger, nor did he see a woman resisting authority. What he saw was the imbalance in the way she carried herself compared to the way she was being treated. Her stillness was not fear but discipline, her silence not guilt but control. It was the kind of composure he had seen countless times before in soldiers trained to hold their ground under immense pressure. He had led men and women like her into battle, had relied on their calm resolve when the world around them descended into chaos. In an instant, he recognized something no one else in the terminal could. She wasn't an ordinary passenger. The airline staff turned to him quickly, eager to explain their version of events, eager to justify why she had been pulled aside. Their words tumbled out in rehearsed lines about security concerns and protocols, but the colonel wasn't listening to them. His attention was fixed on her. He noticed the smallest detail that none of the others had, the subtle way her hand shifted to her side, not nervously, but in a movement drilled into muscle memory, the kind that comes from countless hours of training. Then his eyes fell on the faint glint of metal on her finger. It was subtle, almost hidden, but to him it was unmistakable. The ring. The crowd didn't see it for what it was. To them, it was just a piece of jewelry, insignificant in the storm of suspicion. But the colonel knew. That ring was not something you could buy in a store, not something that could be worn as an accessory. It was a symbol, earned only through the most grueling trials, awarded only to those who had proven themselves in ways most could never imagine. A Navy SEAL ring. In his world, it was a badge of honor, a silent declaration of sacrifice, loyalty, and unmatched skill. For anyone else, it might have been invisible, but for him, it was as clear as a uniform. The realization shifted the entire weight of the scene for him. Here was a woman who had been accused, humiliated, and treated as less than everyone else, while in truth, she carried a burden of service and responsibility that far exceeded those around her. The colonel felt a quiet surge of anger at the injustice of it, at the blindness of those who had failed to see what was right in front of them. He didn't announce his discovery to the crowd. Men like him didn't need to make a show of authority. Instead, his eyes met hers, and in that brief exchange, an understanding passed between them. She didn't flinch, didn't nod, didn't break her composure, but the slightest shift in her stance told him she knew he had recognized the truth. The passengers, oblivious to the meaning of what had just transpired, continued their murmurs. They saw only a man in uniform giving weight to a situation, unaware that what he had uncovered changed everything. The airline staff faltered under his gaze, sensing his authority but not understanding the depth of what he had seen. The colonel, however, now stood as a quiet guardian in the storm. To him, she was no longer just a passenger under suspicion. She was a comrade, a protector, someone who had earned her place not just in that terminal, but in the ranks of those who defend without asking for recognition. The colonel's presence shifted the entire atmosphere in the terminal, but what truly silenced the murmurs was the quiet authority in his voice as he spoke. It was not raised, not laced with anger, but carried a weight that made even the airline staff falter in their rigid stance. He didn't demand, he didn't argue. He simply ordered the airline to stop everything. His words were direct, clear, and carried the kind of authority that did not need to be questioned. It was the kind of tone that had been forged over years of command, the kind that came from someone who had seen life-and-death situations where hesitation could cost lives. And in that moment, the airline employees who had been so insistent suddenly froze, realizing they were no longer in control of the situation. The passengers, who had been eager to witness someone else's downfall, now leaned forward with curiosity. Whispers rippled across the gate as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Why was a colonel stepping in for a passenger? Why did his words carry such finality that even the staff seemed powerless to resist? They had been certain only minutes earlier that she was the problem, the disruption, the reason the flight could not proceed. Yet now, with a single command, everything had changed. The tide had shifted, and with it, the crowd's perception began to waver. The woman, still silent, stood with the same composure she had carried from the beginning. She hadn't pleaded, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't defended herself against the accusations and humiliation. Her strength lay in her silence, in her refusal to break even when she had been treated unjustly. And now, As the colonel's words echoed through the terminal, that silence suddenly seemed less like helplessness and more like restraint. Those who had mocked her, who had cast their silent judgment, now began to wonder if there was something more they hadn't seen. The airline manager hesitated, caught between protocol and the commanding presence of a man whose rank and authority eclipsed his own. His voice faltered as he tried to justify his actions, speaking of rules, regulations, and procedures. But the colonel's piercing gaze cut through his excuses. To the colonel, this wasn't about airline protocol. It was about dignity, about the quiet recognition that something had been deeply wrong with the way she had been treated. And in his world, when something was wrong, you did not stand by and allow it to continue. You corrected it. The colonel gestured toward the woman, his tone unwavering as he insisted that she remain exactly where she was meant to be. The airline staff shuffled uneasily, realizing the decision had already been taken out of their hands. Their authority had been stripped away not by force, but by the sheer presence of someone who commanded respect without needing to raise his voice. The passengers watched in awe, their judgment replaced by uncertainty. They had seen her humiliation, and now they were witnessing her vindication. Every detail mattered in that tense moment. The stillness of the woman, the sharpness of the colonel's tone, the shifting expressions on the faces of the airline staff. It was as if the entire terminal was holding its breath, waiting for someone to make the next move. And yet, beneath the silence, there was an undeniable sense that the balance of power had shifted. What had begun as a moment of shame was now transforming into something else entirely. Some passengers began whispering their doubts to one another. Maybe she wasn't just a regular traveler. Maybe there was more to her story than they had assumed. The colonel's intervention had sparked something in their minds, forcing them to question their earlier judgment. It was no longer so simple to label her as a disruptive passenger or a problem. There was something in the way she carried herself, something in the way the colonel had recognized her, that hinted at a truth far greater than they could imagine. The airline staff, though reluctant, began stepping back. Their earlier dominance had been undone in a matter of seconds. They glanced nervously at each other, unsure of how to proceed, caught between their training and the unmistakable authority standing before them. It was a rare moment where procedure bowed to presence, where the weight of command overruled the rigidity of rules. And in that silence, the passengers, the staff, and the woman herself all understood that something extraordinary was unfolding. The colonel's presence shifted the entire atmosphere in the terminal, but what truly silenced the murmurs was the quiet authority in his voice as he spoke. It was not raised, not laced with anger, but carried a weight that made even the airline staff falter in their rigid stance. He didn't demand, he didn't argue. He simply ordered the airline to stop everything. His words were direct, clear, and carried the kind of authority that did not need to be questioned. It was the kind of tone that had been forged over years of command, the kind that came from someone who had seen life-and-death situations where hesitation could cost lives. And in that moment, the airline employees who had been so insistent suddenly froze, realizing they were no longer in control of the situation. The passengers, who had been eager to witness someone else's downfall, now leaned forward with curiosity. Whispers rippled across the gate as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Why was a colonel stepping in for a passenger? Why did his words carry such finality that even the staff seemed powerless to resist? They had been certain only minutes earlier that she was the problem, the disruption, the reason the flight could not proceed. Yet now, with a single command, everything had changed. The tide had shifted, and with it, the crowd's perception began to waver. The woman, still silent, stood with the same composure she had carried from the beginning. She hadn't pleaded, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't defended herself against the accusations and humiliation. Her strength lay in her silence, in her refusal to break even when she had been treated unjustly. And now, as the colonel's words echoed through the terminal, that silence suddenly seemed less like helplessness and more like restraint. Those who had mocked her, who had cast their silent judgment, now began to wonder if there was something more they hadn't seen. The airline manager hesitated, caught between protocol and the commanding presence of a man whose rank and authority eclipsed his own. His voice faltered as he tried to justify his actions, speaking of rules, regulations, and procedures. But the colonel's piercing gaze cut through his excuses. To the colonel, This wasn't about airline protocol. It was about dignity, about the quiet recognition that something had been deeply wrong with the way she had been treated. And in his world, when something was wrong, you did not stand by and allow it to continue. You corrected it. The colonel gestured toward the woman, his tone unwavering as he insisted that she remain exactly where she was meant to be. The airline staff shuffled uneasily, realizing the decision had already been taken out of their hands. Their authority had been stripped away not by force, but by the sheer presence of someone who commanded respect without needing to raise his voice. The passengers watched in awe, their judgment replaced by uncertainty. They had seen her humiliation, and now they were witnessing her vindication. Every detail mattered in that tense moment. The stillness of the woman, the sharpness of the colonel's tone, the shifting expressions on the faces of the airline staff. It was as if the entire terminal was holding its breath, waiting for someone to make the next move. And yet, beneath the silence, there was an undeniable sense that the balance of power had shifted. What had begun as a moment of shame was now transforming into something else entirely. Some passengers began whispering their doubts to one another. Maybe she wasn't just a regular traveler. Maybe there was more to her story than they had assumed. The colonel's intervention had sparked something in their minds, forcing them to question their earlier judgment. It was no longer so simple to label her as a disruptive passenger or a problem. There was something in the way she carried herself, something in the way the colonel had recognized her, that hinted at a truth far greater than they could imagine. The airline staff, though reluctant, began stepping back. Their earlier dominance had been undone in a matter of seconds. They glanced nervously at each other, unsure of how to proceed, caught between their training and the unmistakable authority standing before them. It was a rare moment where procedure bowed to presence, where the weight of command overruled the rigidity of rules. And in that silence, the passengers, the staff, and the woman herself all understood that something extraordinary was unfolding. The shift in the terminal was almost physical, as though the air itself had changed when the colonel ordered everything to stop. The crowd that had once been so eager to witness humiliation now seemed suspended between curiosity and unease. And then, like a spark catching fire, the truth began to unravel in subtle pieces, each one more shocking than the last. It was not through dramatic revelation, not through loud declarations, but through the quiet power of recognition. The colonel had seen something others had missed, and as his protective stance toward her became evident, the crowd started piecing together what none of them had imagined. Her silence, her composure, her refusal to argue. They were no longer seen as guilt, but as discipline. The way she had stood tall while others sought to diminish her was not weakness, but strength held in reserve. The faint glint of the ring on her finger, once unnoticed, now caught the light in a way that made people wonder. Whispers began to ripple through the terminal. Questions passed from one passenger to another like sparks leaping across dry ground. Who is she? Why is a colonel stepping in for her? Did you see the way she stood? The narrative was shifting before their eyes, and with it, the tide of judgment began to turn. The airline staff, still hesitant, looked increasingly unsettled as they realized they were no longer dealing with just a passenger. They had tried to remove her, tried to strip away her dignity, and now they were facing the weight of their mistake. The colonel's authority had already undone their decisions, but more than that, his recognition had revealed that she was not the powerless figure they had believed her to be. Every passenger watching could sense it. There was more to her than anyone had guessed. The murmurs grew louder when a single phrase slipped from someone's lips, traveling quickly through the crowd. Navy SEAL. It was said in a hushed, almost disbelieving tone, as though the words themselves were too heavy to carry. The effect was immediate. Eyes widened, jaws dropped, and the whispers turned into a wave of speculation. The idea seemed almost impossible. A Navy SEAL? Here, on a commercial flight, being treated like an inconvenience? Yet the evidence was in front of them. The colonel's intervention, the composure she had carried, and that unmistakable ring that no one outside those ranks could ever wear. The passengers' perception shifted from judgment to awe. The woman they had pitted, mocked, or dismissed only minutes before was suddenly transformed in their eyes. No longer was she a helpless victim of circumstance. She was a warrior, someone who had endured trials and dangers beyond their comprehension. Every detail about her that they had overlooked now seemed significant. Her calmness, her silence, her unshaken resolve. It all made sense in the light of her true identity. She wasn't just another traveler. She was someone who had earned her place among the most elite fighters in the world. The airline staff, their confidence shaken, tried to backtrack, but their earlier actions hung in the air like a shadow. They knew the mistake they had made, and the weight of it pressed heavily upon them. To treat an ordinary passenger unjustly was shameful enough, but to humiliate someone who had sacrificed and served in ways they could never imagine, that was something far worse. Their clipped voices softened, their gestures became hesitant, and their control over the situation slipped entirely from their hands. For the passengers, the scene had become something unforgettable. They had witnessed a transformation that challenged their assumptions and humbled their judgments. The whispers of disapproval had turned into murmurs of admiration, even guilt, as they realized how quickly they had condemned her without knowing the truth. They saw her now not as someone to be pitied, but as someone to be respected, someone who had carried herself with more strength and silence than most could in 1,000 words. The colonel remained at her side, not as a savior, but as someone who simply recognized what she was and refused to let injustice stand. He didn't need to explain, didn't need to make an announcement. His actions alone spoke volumes, and the respect he carried extended to her in a way that no passenger could miss. The atmosphere in the terminal was thick with revelation, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the shock of the truth. And there she stood, unchanged in her expression, her composure unbroken. She didn't revel in the shift of perception, didn't seek the admiration now being whispered around her. For her, it was never about recognition. She had walked into the storm of humiliation with her head held high, and now, as the truth emerged, she remained just as steady. The crowd could speculate, the staff could stumble, and the colonel could stand as her silent ally, but she carried within her the quiet strength of someone who didn't need validation. She had already proven herself in battles far greater than this.